Hello, hello. Today I want to talk about two books, Austerlitz by Sebald and one that I read on the internet called Kick the Latch by Kathryn Scanlan. They both have similarities that I did not expect. So Kick the Latch, it's a very, very short novel written entirely based on conversations between the author and a woman named Sonia, who was a horse person, training horses, grooming horses for races. It's based entirely in Sonia's language. Scanlan had several phone calls with Sonia that she recorded over the course of a few years and took that language. There is no single anecdote or story in the novel that goes on for longer than 4 pages, I think is the longest one. So they are driven totally by Sonia's voice. I mean, that is one thing that is very clear about the book. Scanlan's books are deceptively simple. I think require many reads. I only read this one once in 2 afternoons, simultaneous actually to finishing Austerlitz. And yeah, I have one of Scanlan's earlier book called Aughnine Fog, and it's composed in a kind of similar way, using diaries that she found from someone's estate sale and taking the language and the sentences in those diaries and over years and years editing, arranging, and making them into a unique piece through another person's voice. So Kick the Latch and Aughnine Fog are both very compelling. All of that is strikingly similar to Austerlitz. I've read Austerlitz and A Brief History of Natural Destruction. That's not what it's called. What is it called? It's called On the Natural History of Destruction. Here, I'll pull it out. I've read this one by Sebald, just finished Austerlitz. And okay, so I've known that a lot of his work is taken from others and taken from life and reality, using other people's language, other people's stories. I found some of his former writing students share his tips that he gave them, and one of which was write down quotes without attributing to the quote to its source in your journal, and then you'll have a journal filled with things that are very inspiring to you, that instead of being off limits in someone else's are now fodder for you to change, manipulate, guide you into new thoughts and all of that. They're accessible instead of curtained by a quote. Austerlitz, the biographical detail, was all pretty much taken from another person's story that Sebald didn't attribute at all. There's no mention of the woman whose story that he took the biographical details from and made into this book. I mean, a lot of people have a lot to say about that. I think that Austerlitz is very similar to Kathryn Scanlan's work in different ways, though. The main character is Jacques Austerlitz. For the first 30 pages or so, they are talking primarily about architectural details of buildings in mid-20th century Europe, about buildings from Europe's golden age, from early 19th century to very early 20th century. What happens after the next 30 pages is that the narrator, who has met Austerlitz, lets Austerlitz tell the story for the rest of the book. We don't know anything about the narrator other than his language closely resembles Austerlitz, and also that is willing to give Austerlitz an ear for extended time. What it is essentially the same thing that Kathryn and Sonia are doing, but it's happening in the narrative itself. What he always does in his fiction is to create, I don't even know about narrative, but to create and compose based on life, based on anecdotes, based on stories, based on photographs. There are so many photographs in this book that he writes based on, and you get the sense that he is only comfortable with composing without the imagination being the initial and primary impulse. Austerlitz is a book that is, all of its details are not from the imagination, but how those details connect and their meanings and their functions narratively are the result of Sebald's imagination. It's a fantastic book. It's a very, very slow, and I love slow fiction. Lately, I haven't been so much. I've been enjoying a lot of voice-driven stuff. This is not a voice-driven work. The language, I would say, is pretty traditionally literary, but the documentary nature is much more closer to essay and to nonfiction, which, if you know Sebald and you want to read fiction that reads like nonfiction, Sebald is the person to read. So you have two authors who are using artifacts from reality as opposed to creating something wholly from imagination. Some of the ways of interpreting that are that the writing that Sebald or Scanlan is doing is perhaps not the same, or some people, I think, view it as having less distinction because it doesn't arise solely from imagination. There is no one who exists without and I think there's something very interesting about putting those influences directly, in Scanlan's case attributed, in Sebald's case unattributed, and the work is to illuminate reality and to place it and to compose it in such a way so that it can have an effect on the writer and the reader, whereas the writer who works solely from imagination is saying in some ways, yes, I have influences, but they will not enter into this space directly, and yet all of their imagination is influenced. So I don't know, I'm not saying there's any right or wrong way, but I do find it beautiful, and in both of these books leads to something that is quite deceptive. In Kick the Latch, there is this deceptive simplicity, and yet you are totally immersed in this character's reality instantly, and there's terminology that the definitions are assumed. That's always an effective way of getting someone into a world, by using words that the readers feel like they can understand, even though they've never seen or heard before. Then they feel like they're an insider, which brings them closer into the character and the world. Whereas the simplicity, the deceptiveness in Sebald's work doesn't come from simplicity, but it comes from multiple, very subtle, long-form metaphors that lace their way subtextually throughout the work. I think it's a work that would require both books, I think, asked to be read several times. His almost imperceptible tools that he's using that keeps a reader going. Very similar to V.S. Naipaul, where some of his books are so slow, you don't really understand why you're continuing to read them, and yet you still find something there that keeps you going. Those formal tools become imperceptible. It comes from writers who learn the rules, and instead of breaking the rules, like I would think of, like Peter Handke was writing these formally very strange, linguistically off the charts books, whereas writers like Naipaul and like Sebald learn the rules, perfect the rules, and take the rules to their conclusions and then write from that place. So you're reading someone who has mastered something instead of fought and worked in opposition to it. Scanlan, I think, is also doing something that not many writers have thought, which is take themselves out of the book as much as possible and give other people's voices and life experiences the artistic and aesthetic treatment that she sees them deserving and calling for and asking for. But it isn't about Scanlan, it's about these people. I think Austerlitz is about Sebald, as much as the story doesn't involve him or his biographical details. I do think that Austerlitz's voice is his voice. Austerlitz's ideas and perceptions and longings are Sebald's longings, where I don't necessarily feel that about any of Scanlan's books, which is really quite an artistic and amazing feat. And it's something you can feel while you read, is that she is using understanding and a deep kind of listening to transform these artifacts into literature. And I don't know of too many writers who do what Scanlan does, and I think it's easy to gloss over because her works are short, they are simple, quote unquote, but Scanlan is doing something that is really, really impressive. And Kick the Latch has had a lot of success too as a book, which makes me really hopeful for what people have an appetite to read. It's been a critical success. It's also been a very successful selling book. That makes me feel really happy that people want to read books like Kick the Latch. And both of these books are something that is very fun to read close to one another or at the same time. You know, if you tire of Sebald's kind of slow and winding and plotless ruminations and the objectivity and the documentary style and the nonfiction feel of Austerlitz or any of his other books, you know, Nine Fog, Kick the Latch, Kathryn Scanlan's books are a really cool way to experience a similar artistic impulse executed in an entirely different way. But yeah, these books are very good. I'm glad I read them together. And that's all I have to say for the rest of the time.